Hey y'all, and welcome to Brawl. My name is Brian, and Representative Hageman shuts down the slimy Jamie Raskin and has to remind him of what the Constitution actually says. Let's dive in.
I think that it's very clear, especially starting in 2017 when President Trump was sworn in the first time, that the courts have been used for nefarious purposes on a variety of issues. In fact, yesterday we had a hearing in our constitutional subcommittee about lawfare and how lawfare had been weaponized against President Trump, both while he was president as well as after his presidency. So again, I guess that I'm very skeptical of the idea that people are not willing to use lawfare to go after a current or former president. We've seen it over the last 9 years in many different instances. But the president is the one who gets to define the limit and scope of the duties of the personnel within his office. That is very clear from Article 2 of the Constitution.
Will the gentlelady yield for a question on that?
Yes.
But I assume you've read the Chief Justice's opinion in Trump versus United States. And if so, are you saying that this decision was wrongly decided in distinguishing between core functions of the president, where his discretion is indeed absolute, as you suggest, the official acts that are not within his core functions, where Chief Justice Roberts says that's subject to a balancing test, and then private and unofficial acts where he doesn't get to define it all, that's up to the court?
We're not talking about immunity. We're talking about something entirely different. It's about who gets to define, who defines, and I think—
But that's precisely what they did with respect to immunity.
It's the gentlelady's time.
Okay.
When you read the decision, they did not strip the president of the ability to define or limit the scope—
Yes, they did.
—the duties of the personnel within
They
his
said
office.
if it's private and unofficial, the court will know it. And that's exactly what this is about. If you rob a bank, you can't say that's part of my duties because I'm trying to reform the CFPB.
And that's not what he's saying. When you're defining or limiting the scope of the duties of an official within the executive branch official of the executive office of the president, all we're trying to do is prevent the violation of the separation of powers, as I've indicated. And
No, you're trying to strip the court of substantive jurisdiction over the president's powers, and you can't do that. It's emphatically the province and the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is, including over the president.
That is not what this provision says.
Well, if it doesn't, what does it say then? What does it mean to say no court may define or limit the scope of the duties of an official of the executive office of the president?
The executive office, the president has the ability to define the scope of the individuals that work within the scope and the duties of the individuals that work in his office.
So that could include criminal actions.
That is not for a state court or a federal court to define.
So that could include criminal actions.
That is absolutely an absurdity to even
Well,
make
then
that
you're not reading
allegation.
Chief Justice Roberts' opinion. That's what it's all about. How do we constrain executive power?
When you read this language, it says that no court may take over that role. No court may define or limit the scope of the duties of an official of the executive office of the president, the people who work in the executive office. I think that what your amendment does is a violation of separation of powers, and it's a violation of Article 2 of the Constitution.
The gentlelady yield?
Yes, I will.
It's always good when the constitutionalist specialist comes in. It helps us all. So what you're saying is that the bill codifies Article 2 for purposes of the court being reminded and instructed of their limitations, and the amendment would undo that.
That's exactly right, because then it would imply that a federal court could in fact define or limit the scope of the duties of those individuals who work within the executive office of the president, and that is not a federal court's role. That is for, under Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, that power is vested in a president of the United States of America.
Whenever Jamie Raskin gets up to speak, I know that I'm going to need an ibuprofen. I'm going to need something to deal with the incoming headache. Because the dude has proven time and time again that not only does he not really know what he's doing, he doesn't even know what he's saying. The whole point and purpose of the 9-0 Supreme Court decision regarding what Donald Trump could not do when it comes to foreign policy was simply this. It was a slap on the wrist to the lower district court saying that you cannot tell the president what to do and how to do it. All right? That's what the Supreme Court admitted. If the president is doing his job, you can't interfere with that unless there's some actual legal case being brought to bear. And that's why every single member of the Supreme Court voted for this. This is more of the politics of power, because the Supreme Court, they kind of do their own thing. They're not elected, obviously. They don't run for re-election. But they're sort of the guardians in their minds. They believe that they're standing guard over the Constitution. And for the most part, they do a pretty decent job. Thankfully, Trump got to appoint 3 of them. So we finally got that back. But the whole point and purpose of the Supreme Court isn't just to make sure that the states are not squabbling and not fighting in between with each other, making sure the federal government's doing its job, making sure Congress isn't overstepping the Constitution, and the same thing with the White House. Okay, that's what the Supreme Court is there to do. But they also have an extra motive. They want to protect the integrity of the Supreme Court, because if you lose that, that's the last little linchpin in democracy. And the Democrats have been wanting to take over the courts ever since FDR tried to pack them during his terrible years during the Great Depression. The Supreme Court got the decision completely correct, because the president was enacting foreign policy. He was deporting people that needed to be deported, and the Supreme Court reminded the lower court that no, you might have some ability to say you can stop this, but you cannot order a president around. And now the Republicans are starting to realize, oh, we need to codify some stuff. We got to codify the Doge cuts, but we've also got to make sure that, hey, no one can have too much power in interfering with a president who is trying to do good work on the behalf of the American people. All right, Jamie Raskin is trying to fight against that, and he's clawing tooth and nail, trying to get a word in edgewise, when the reality is he has no idea what he's talking about. And here's what Ms. Hageman was actually referencing. The Constitution itself, ladies and gentlemen, Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. It's that simple. Okay? The lower courts might be able to say this is legal or illegal, but they can't tell a president what to do. And Jamie Raskin was perfectly fine with that when it was happening against, the dude that's not from his party. Okay? So yeah, Jamie Raskin continues to prove that he has no idea what he's talking about, and it just makes me wonder. There's no way the Democrats don't know the Constitution, or else they wouldn't be trying to violate it so often. It's maddening. It's maddening because the entire sort of meta-narrative of Republican politics, there's a couple of running themes, like trying to take down the nanny state that almost got here under the Great Society and the New Deal. But another one has been trying to preserve the Constitution as much as humanly possible. And the Supreme Court can only go so far, because remember, they are guardians at the gate. They don't run out in the sortie. They don't go out and do something proactive. They simply guard the gates. And that's why we have a Congress. That's what they're supposed to be doing. So now they've realized that they need to make some reforms out there to make sure that the lower branches of the federal judiciary aren't going overboard, because they currently are. We've seen the lawfare being used against the American people under the Biden administration. We've seen it happen time and time again to President Trump. And now we're trying, the Republican Party is having a pretty good time trying to codify certain things, because again, more pressure needs to be put on them. They've got to codify these Doge cuts. But just as importantly, they've got to make sure that the judiciary isn't just drunk on its own power. That's not a fair deal for the American people. And that's Congress's whole MO. Their job is to write the laws, ladies and gentlemen. It's their job to set certain policy tones. They need to step up their game, and it's finally happening. It only took an entire MAGA movement to get Congress off their rear ends, but of course, this is also the lady, remember, who Hageman replaced. She replaced one of the worst blights that we have had on the Republican Party. I almost called him Karl Rove, but we dodged a massive bullet in getting the Cheneys out of power as much as we possibly could. And now that power base is gone. and the American people, and I'm pretty sure there are nations worldwide who are deeply thankful for this wonderful turn of events. I am glad that Hageman beat the tar out of Liz Cheney, because we deserve someone who's actually going to fight for the American people and not, Halliburton. So this is refreshing. If it wasn't for the one fly in the ointment that is Jamie Raskin, we would have a wonderful little discussion on how to make sure that the judiciary isn't drunk on its own power. But of course, he has to ask something really dumb and has nothing to do with the incoming legislation. And as usual, it's a whiny Trump, Trump, Trump kind of attitude from a high-ranking Democrat official. That story never gets old, does it? Folks, my name is Brian. Hope you enjoyed that segment here on Politibrawl. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you on the next one. Till then, y'all have a good one.